their social structure. All right, so it's actually pretty similar to what Europe was like at the same time. Sorry if you can't really see, I'll make sure I read it out. At the top, you had a king and a royal family. So, hint, it was a monarchy. All right. The king was actually called the Ghana. All right, that's where the name of the empire comes from, is the name of the king. They also had nobles, but what was different than the European nobles was to be a noble did not necessarily mean that you owned a bunch of land and had peasants and serfs and slaves working on it. It just meant that you were of higher status. Okay. Then there were peasants who were given some rights, such as the right to trial, and they had an opportunity to own land, but they still, there was not much social mobility between the classes, so they could never get up to that noble level. And then there was slavery in the Ghana Empire, basically the exact same thing as in Europe at the time, how there was serfs. Okay, serfs and slaves were basically interchangeable words. There's no rights or no power. Okay, and we'll kind of go over how some of the politics worked in a second here so that you could understand what powers they would have. If you don't need to draw it out as a triangle, if you don't want to, if you can, that's great. But essentially, their social structure was very similar to the rest of the world. Okay, there's no mobility. And basically, if you're born wealthy, you stay wealthy. If you're not born wealthy, you're not going to ever get wealthy. All right? Can I go on to the next thing? No. Okay. You did? All right. So some easy things to kind of think about here, because whenever we take notes, you got to be thinking to yourself, well, how would this be a test question, right? So I just told you that we'll have a test on the Middle Ages and on the Muslim world and on these Western African kingdoms all at the same time. So an easy question might be, what was the difference between the European social structure versus the Ghana social structure? And the difference is in these middle two levels. Just the fact that the nobles were not necessarily landowners like they always were in that feudalism system we saw in Europe. And the peasants did have some rights. Not all peasants were essentially slaves. There was a little bit of difference. Does that make sense? Yes?
So could peasants own land?
They could own land. It was never going to be that much. They didn't have a lot of access to money. But they did have a chance to own land. It wouldn't be like you're a peasant, you can never own land. All right. Can I go now? Okay. All right. Next, the political structure. So it was an authoritarian monarchy, much like we saw in Europe. So it's headed by this royal family, and they did have a very big military. So because of that, it was kind of do what the king wished. And that's how it went. Now, as you can see up here, there is a little map in the background, so you can see this dark orange area is where the Mali Empire was. So it was a pretty big area for one person to rule over the whole thing. So the head Ghana or king would have smaller areas blocked off to where he would have his friends maybe rule different areas just because it's so far away. And they'd also be called kings. One interesting thing about how they would do any sort of, like what we would do in court today, is it was all through the king. So if you think about if you had a dispute with a neighbor, right? They stole something from my house, all right? How this would work is if you were, as long as you were a peasant or a noble, you could bring your complaint to the king. And the king would sit there, listen to both sides, and then pass judgment. The king always listened to all cases, so a lot of what the king did was actually act as a judge. So kind of just an interesting thing that you didn't see anything like that in Europe, where people had the chance to bring problems directly to the government like that. And then another interesting thing that's a little bit different that you might not have seen before is it was a matrilineal monarchy. What this means is it was not passed down from the king's son. It was actually passed down from the king's sister's son. So the next king would be the son of the king's sister, which is kind of interesting.
Why does she have a son?
Yeah.
Well, then there would be a lot of different rules. You could do a bunch of different situations. Essentially, it would be the closest female figure's son. So if they had to go with a cousin or something along those lines. And but most of the time, this is how it would work. Sister's son. All right. So that's basically the political structure. Just think of a monarchy. You have a king. The king does have advisors. But essentially, it is a king. Do what this king says. All right. Can I go forward?
I have a question.
No? Yes.
So if the wife had two sons, but didn't have a sister, would the older son be appointed like king, and then the next king would be the brother?
Can you repeat that? So, hang on. So the wife of the king
Yeah.
has two sons. All right. No sister.
No sister.
I mean, I don't know every little rule they did, but I would assume if there was no sisters and no other close relatives that they would just do the son. But I think just the preferred way would be the sister's son. And also remember, in the year 800, people had a lot of children, so it's pretty unlikely that you wouldn't have a sister. I'm just saying, I mean, families were huge. All right, next. Interaction with the environment. Next. Why won't it work? Okay, interaction with the environment. Oh, see, of course, it lagged. All right, so I heard a little bit of an intro about gold. Ghana had a lot of it. It's said that they had up to 2/3 of all the gold mined in the world in about the year 1500. So they had a ton of it. And essentially, the empire rested right on top of a huge gold mine. To extract the gold from the ground, they actually built huge structures, huge mines that would require miners to go 100 feet underground. So if you're thinking it's very dangerous, so who do you guys think would be the miners in this case? Slaves or peasants, right? So it was dangerous work. They did have a lot of gold, but they were able to engineer these structures that were 100 feet below ground in order to extract the gold. The area of where the gold was in between the Senegal and Niger rivers, and essentially it was one of the biggest gold deposits in the entire world. Now, one interesting thing is that they did not have is they had almost no access to salt. Now, one thing that's very important to understand about salt is you can't survive without salt as a human being. You need salt in your diet. Yes?
Are these people that, didn't we learn this last year? They were the salt trade thing?
If you did a project on the Ghana Empire, you would have.
Something like that, right? Yeah. I think I did that.
Good stuff. Happy you learned from it, Juan. All right, but so basically there was also agriculture and farming, but the main thing that you'll see in the history books will be about the gold as the interaction with the environment. All right? All right, do you need another minute? Or are we good? Somebody say something. Good?
No, wait, I need more.
It's okay.
You don't speak up. Come on.
All right, I can always come back to it later on too if you need me to. All right. Cultural. Okay. What's interesting about almost all of the West African civilizations is their language was never written down. So there's something called an oral tradition where stories were passed down from generation to generation. But that has been one thing which makes it hard for historians to study, is since there's not a lot of written down texts that people can go back and read. Some of the achievements of the Ghana Empire are kind of lost. Now, culturally, or remember at this period of time, religion is a huge part of everybody's life. They started off, they would just, at the beginning of the empire, 800, 900, 1,000, basically practicing traditional religions. So it would depend on what area of the empire you were in, but their religions were not what would be things that are really practiced today. And then in 1100, the whole empire converted to Islam, and even the king became a Muslim. So think about this is kind of that time where Islam is spreading into North Africa. Converted to Islam in 1100. 4 words. Just write that.
Whoa.
What?
1100?
There you go.
I read it.
All right. Economic. So we talked about how the empire became wealthy from the gold mining and from trade. Now, one way that they became really wealthy from trade is that when you have a lot of gold, other people want it. All right, so any traders that came would be taxed. So that tax money that they're taking in from people trying to trade with them also supplies them with a lot of wealth. Beyond the fact that they just had all this gold that is valuable in and of itself, that the tax of it created a very, very, very large way to make income for the government. Also, they needed salt. I told you this before. And since you need salt to live, one of the big trades was between gold and salt. And essentially, gold was as valuable as salt in the Ghana Empire because you needed it to live. So they were more than happy to trade gold for salt. Right? So one of the big...
for other empires that had a lot of salt.
Huh?
So that would be good for other empires that had a lot of salt.
Yeah, so, there was a lot of salt in the Sahara Desert just north of them, so that was primarily who they were trading with. One other thing is the kings were very smart. They knew that if they did not limit the supply of gold to their people, so they had to stow it and hide it, that the gold would actually lose its value. Because they had so much of it. So they actually did try to limit some of the supplies. Some of the things that I read about it said they actually had so much gold that even their animals were wearing gold jewels and stuff on them, like dogs and horses and everything. So it seemed like they really had a ton of it and were incredibly, incredibly wealthy. All right, so those are the 5 spice categories. The rest of this will be on your own. If you look at the other sections, they have page numbers and chapter titles. This will be due on Thursday, which we only have 20 minutes. I'll give you some time on Thursday to work on it as well because it's 3 different things. Feel free to work with a partner on this. But I want you guys working together, not just copying word for word from each other. Does that make sense? All right. So anyways, that is Ghana. Are there any questions about Ghana?